After over 10 years working on the Universal Audio Apollo ecosystem, I am officially leaving UA for someone else. So, to find out who I'm leaving for and the why behind the move, stay tuned for the video. I bought my first UA Apollo twin in 2014. I was midway through a audio engineering associate's degree. I did audio engineering trade school from 2013 to 2015, so I was halfway through that. And up until then, I had used a whole bunch of different audio interfaces. Everything from old Tascam units where I kind of started to M Audio to Avid and DigiDesign products as well. And then I ended up on Focusrite. And coming from all those products, the Apollo was such a game changer. I will never forget plugging in my JBL LSR monitors for the very first time into the Apollo as opposed to into my Focusrite products. It was mind-blowing. My pan knobs, I remember just feeling like I had been panning at like 60 or 70% of width, in my DAW and Pro Tools. It was so much different. It's so much wider sounding, through the converters in the Apollo. Flash forward, another few years, it was 2020 and the world was all breaking loose and I was doing a lot of remote recording and production, in my home studio, and recording with a lot of different projects. It was time I found to upgrade. It had been, like 6 years since then, and I was kind of starting to feel the limitations of the Apollo twin, both in terms of DSP and in terms of just overall I/O. And so I wasn't even really thinking, honestly, too much about converters at that point. I had worked and freelanced in a bunch of different studios in town and during school, and I'd experienced higher end converters, but not in a meaningful way at home, in a sense, where I did a lot of my work. And so I think there's a huge difference between hearing something in a pro studio and then hearing it at home, just in terms of all the different kind of components in a studio. You're wondering, is it the monitor system that they have? Is it the preamps and microphones that they have much higher fidelity? Or is it like the converter? How big of a part does the converter play in the grand scope of things? My personal take is it plays a bigger role than most people give it credit for. And so that was much the same. When I upgraded my audio interface, I went to the bigger brother, in the series. And, converters had gone up in quality too by that point. It'd been multiple gens since the Apollo that I was on. So I bought the X6 as it seemed to be, the next step up at that time. It was enormous. The transformation, that I was hearing through my monitors. I was monitoring on Focals at the time. And it literally felt like I had bought different monitors, and upgraded significantly. Everything from reverb tails and delays to panning moves to EQ, bumps, even just tiny fractions of a dB. It felt like I could hear them significantly better. Everything sounded way more, wide. You had more space in between the different elements of the stereo field, and it was huge. Like it, I did some of my best mixes of the time through that, system. It was really impressive, just how much of a difference it had actually made. But again, flash forward a few years later, I feel like there's like this kind of like pattern of like every few years, some new tech kind of comes out that significantly improves, and it's just like I feel like I go down another rabbit hole of research, and this is basically what ended up happening. I started using more outboard preamps, and I had been using those at previous stages, in my career as well. But I started specifically using them on the line inputs on the Apollo, on the X6. And so I started getting a better understanding of what the actual converters were doing on the way in, as opposed to just the preamp. And what I started to find over the next few years is that it sounded to me like the converters on the Apollo were coloring the signal. as I went down the rabbit hole of research, I found that when you actually started searching for it, this is actually the case. That the Apollo, converters, which up till that point, I had thought were kind of state of the art and high fidelity, as could be. I thought that they were kind of the best really around, and that they were super uncolored and super transparent. And that just seemed to be not the case the more I researched it. Around this time, this is 2024, late 2024, I was starting to research this more and more, and it was just kind of at the back of my mind until it started becoming more of an obsession. I feel like a lot of you might be able to relate. Once you start, obsessing over, those kind of pieces of gear, you go down the rabbit hole of research, and it just starts to become more and more all-consuming. So around this time, early 2025, I made a trip out to Nashville as we're kind of considering a move out to Nashville. And I got the chance to, rub shoulders with a lot of the people that I've followed over the years. Everyone, that I had followed since I was like a young kid. And even like, more recently, getting to, spend some time out at Andrew Master's place and getting his take on it, in terms of converters. It seemed all across the board, all these people I talked to, there was a difference between standalone higher end converters and the converters that come in an audio interface. I wanted to invest in higher end converters. I wanted transparency kind of at its core so that I could hear what I was doing even better. And, all the high fidelity, guitar recordings that I do like to do on my channel, that we'd have high fidelity kind of recordings for shootouts. So you can really hear the difference between each of the guitars that we're doing comparisons on. And just all around better sounding mixes for me as I can hear better, what I'm kind of doing. I went down the rabbit hole and I was kind of in three parks for what I was looking at. I kind of vetoed kind of early on the idea of kind of going full in on a Pro Tools HD system, just basically for a number of reasons that I'm not going to go into now. But what I kind of ended up with was either Antelope, Apogee, and then RME. And Antelope, I quickly ended up discarding just because even though there are certain people who have really good, results with them, I mean, their converter quality is undeniable. They sound really good from what I found. The problem is, as many of you may know, it's really hard to do a Google search on Antelope without coming up with countless amounts of negative kind of, experiences. I ended up even honestly just calling Vintage King and Sound Pure just to get their take on it, because Sweetwater, ironically, doesn't actually carry Antelope for some unknown reason. And what I found was at both of those places, they have a ton of warranty claims on Antelope stuff. Everything from their smaller kind of rigs to larger, studio rigs as well. And so what I didn't want to have happen is invest a good chunk of change into an audio interface that was going to be my kind of like standalone driver throughout the day, when I'm working with, upwards of 100 students a week, and then doing recording projects as well. I didn't want it to be able to, just sound good one moment and then suddenly fail due to drivers or whatnot the next day. And so I quickly vetoed that and went down kind of the other options with Apogee and RME. And what I found between the two, Apogee goes for more of that kind of saturated kind of sound, whereas RME is a lot more kind of transparent. It really came down to those two. The thing that with it kind of drove me away a little bit from Apogee was just kind of the lack of innovativeness, I would say, in their more recent product line. It doesn't seem like they're gearing products towards what I myself need on a daily basis. And so that ended up getting vetoed, although, their converters, again, are without a doubt very, very, very high fidelity. They're very good converters. So I was kind of looking at RME, and the issue that I kept on coming back to was while they do support, their products for forever, it seemed like, I started finding a whole bunch of people online who were having issues specifically with RME and the Apple Silicon products, ironically, which I've been an early adopter of the Apple Silicon when they first came out up until now. I've had a lot of Apple Silicon computers. I think actually over 15 Mac computers since, I was doing a lot of video editing and needed various things as well for different companies. And so I've used a lot of the Apple Silicon. So that was kind of a problem because I kept hearing and seeing different reports that the RME stuff wasn't working well. And even some guys that I was talking to in regards to RME were saying that RME even themselves was saying, whether that's true or not, that they just don't function as well with the Apple Silicon stuff. It's more geared towards specifically USB line products where I was used to using Thunderbolt. And so this gave me a little bit of a quandary now because I spent all this time researching. I knew that I wanted to enhance the sound. I wanted more transparency. I wanted, wider feeling stereo imaging. I wanted more depth and contrast and separation just in what I was hearing and more detail on the way in for when I was recording those shootouts and whatnot. And so into the mix came the Lynx Aurora. In some of the early Sound Pure videos that I had been a huge fan of watching over the years and listening to some of the shootouts that they do between microphones, I love their channel. That's actually what they were using in a lot of their videos was the Lynx Aurora based on its transparency and not affecting the signal in any way so that, you are just getting saturation from the individual piece of gear that you are adding in. So there's no coloration. And this started to become a huge, now again, rabbit hole dive, was into Lynx Aurora. What I started to find is when I looked at all the mastering studios, for instance, around, a lot of them, a huge portion of them were using the Lynx Aurora based on the or the Lynx Aurora or the Hilo, I should say, with that. And so I kind of went down the dive of research there. Around the same time, I had a buddy turn me on to Analog Access, which if you're unfamiliar, it's basically a company that allows you to interface with your DAW with various, types of hardware units that they have in their studio. So you can remotely control, they have literally, it's crazy. It's these little robotic systems that basically control all the individual knobs of hardware and you can adjust it on the UI in their system. So you can basically effectively have a, multi-six-figure, kind of studio of outboard gear and use it remotely, control it within your own DAW or their standalone. I started printing my mixes through various, kind of hardware units that I didn't have access to. And along the way, I started doing that with their converters. They had both the Lynx Aurora converters and they had all the high-end Antelope stuff. And so this was actually kind of cool because as someone who had been interested in Antelope, I was able to get an idea for what they sounded like if you actually printed your mixes through them to see if there was actually any improvement. What I was shocked to find is just even doing that on the loop back between my Apollo, the Lynx Aurora, all done, remotely, and the Antelope kind of higher end stuff. They had kind of the the Galaxy or whatever the higher end kind of Antelope system is. And so what I noticed actually was very audibly, there were significant differences when I started printing my mixes back through, or just even, in individual tracks through those two, interfaces as opposed to my Apollo. And what I found is while I did like the Antelope stuff, it almost felt like it added too much width, almost like phasing kind of issues when I would run my mixes through it. And so it added this nice sheen where there was more depth, there was more space. It felt ridiculously wide, but almost very, dare I say, almost sterile. So clean it felt sterile in my mixes. Whereas when I ran the, Aurora, and printed through the Aurora remotely with Analog Access, it sounded like it did the same kind of things, but it had a more realistic stereo field, much wider than my Apollo, but more realistic and less phasing issues that I was kind of hearing. And it sounded so transparent. It didn't feel like it was doing tremendous things to the actual stereo field in terms of saturating it and whatnot. And so this was kind of like the last, thing to just tip me over the edge to get me, to pull the trigger on buying it. And so I ended up purchasing it. And if it's terrible in the first week, just send it back, Now, One of the biggest striking things to me about the Aurora, as someone who had used other, trendy kind of devices in the past, is the level of marketing that UA, for instance, has. There's so much that goes in on the box and just in the overall experience. This was not the case with the Lynx Aurora. In fact, literally the Lynx came in this super white paper kind of box, very not sexy in its way, as opposed to the really sexy marketing that UA has and many other, pieces of equipment. And even the manual, I was shocked. It was actually, in a way, it was kind of refreshing because it just spoke to me of like that human touch. But like literally, it was a straight paper printed out kind of manual, and it was extremely in-depth. It was extremely detailed, even like some handwritten kind of components, so much different than like the typical scan the QR code that UA has. So it was very different. The setup experience was very different because they just run the way their console, their version of kind of console kind of works with routing, was a lot different feeling and experience wise. I also had some issues downloading the wrong driver too. They had the wrong drivers posted for Apple Silicon at the time. But once I got it up and running, it was fairly short. It was within a day. It was absolutely astonishing how different it sounded than the Apollo. It blew my mind when I first plugged in my monitors to my very first original Apollo. This was the same experience, but significantly way more over the top. I would argue, honestly, this was the single biggest differential of quality, like overall professional quality, that I had ever made in my career, in the last really 17, 18 years working in audio. The difference just blew my mind. I mean, the stereo field alone, plugging my monitors into the Aurora, it felt like there was just no line in the monitor. There was no saturation that didn't need to be there. The reverbs and delays, they stick out. Like you can hear every individual little tail. Tiny little edits that were bad edits, that I hadn't heard before, popped right into focus, on things. Missed crossfades, for instance, EQ moves, just tiny little adjustments, just they pop instantly noticeably on the Aurora. The stereo field itself, things that like on my Apollo I felt like were centered, were not even centered. Like it almost felt like I had the wrong idea of what center and left right even felt like. When I flipped to the Aurora, it was just transformative. Like I could feel the individual just spaces and pockets of space in the stereo field. It was incredible. I was literally in tears listening to it for the first time through the Aurora, because those frustrations that I had had for so long, that I was just like, I saw people online say, oh, converters don't make that much of a difference. It's the 21st century. We've got good converters. Everything is about the same. And while I would agree for the generic kind of like populace, I would say that's true. There was such a difference, such an audible difference between my Apollo, which already had great converters. These were just a tier above, and a noticeable tier above. So in terms of like even just how this has affected me in daily life, I do want to talk about that a little bit. I teach guitar for a living, and so I'm constantly picking out things by ear, and so what I'm hearing is extremely important. When I'm charting stuff out and transcribing, I transcribe like 4,000 songs a year for students. It has changed so much and improved my workflow. I pick up things so much faster than I was even on the Apollo. And again, the Apollo is not bad. It is a very good piece of equipment. However, this is just echelons above. And I think everyone who has experienced standalone converters, higher end converters, would have to agree with that. It is a big difference. And so it's sped up my workflow so much, just being able to hear things, but also too on the input stage. Some of the best, most, sounds that I've been so happy with have come now out of the Aurora. Some of my best guitar recordings, vocal recordings. It's transparent, it's not coloring the signal. So then if I want to add saturation through either a saturated preamp or even just in post, with saturation, I feel like I can do that and not be saturating something that's already saturated to begin with and more colored. It's so nice. I feel finally like at peace with kind of the sound that I'm getting. I'm not hearing, something that's conflicting with my ears. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna actually pass some audio through this because I want you guys to hear the difference and, see on your end, if there actually is a difference that you can hear audibly. I'm also going to link up the actual raw files to the recordings that I do, so you can listen to them, so it's not compressed in YouTube as well. So I'll be sure to include that link in the description. But what we're going to do is we're going to run a couple mixes that were not recorded on my Apollo. We're gonna take a mix that was recorded and mixed through a budget kind of interface and see what the difference is when you run that mix back through and print it back through the better converters in the Apollo. And then we're going to compare that with the Lynx as well. And we'll go a step further too. I'm actually going to record a guitar and a vocal through both simultaneously, so it's the same performance. And we're going to use the same outboard preamp going to two different audio interfaces. And then we can A/B it back and forth so you can kind of hear what the differences truly are. I'm going to be curious what you guys think down in the comments. So without any further ado, let's dive on in. It seems so often I lose my way. The chaos of this world seems to pull me away from you. Oh, it pulls me away from you. Whether the work of my hands or a shiny new toy, another prescription to bring me joy. Oh, you, it pulls me away from you. I find myself drifting further away from shore. Waves crash over and I can't feel the bottom. I'm way out of depth here in these waters. Won't you save me? I know you can save me. I know you can save me. It seems so often I lose my way. The chaos of this world seems to pull me away from you. Oh, it pulls me away from you. Whether the work of my hands or a shiny new toy, another prescription to bring me joy. Oh, you, it pulls me away from you. I find myself drifting further away from shore. Waves crash over and I can't feel the bottom. I'm way out of depth here in these waters. Won't you save me? I know you can save me. I know you can save me. Life is so bittersweet, full of hope but full of grief. The ups and downs, the ebbs and flows, and all this as our summer goes away. Our summer goes away. The emptiness I feel inside is only as small as a nickel or dime, but as time goes on I seem to think it's as large as a grand estate somewhere, so far away from here. When will I open up my eyes and see the world so beautiful around me?
Life is so bittersweet, full of hope but full of grief. The ups and downs, the ebbs and flows, and all this as our summer goes away. Our summer goes away. The emptiness I feel inside is only as small as a nickel or dime, but as time goes on I seem to think it's as large as a grand estate somewhere, so far away from here. When will I open up my eyes and see the world so beautiful around me? So beautiful around me. When will I lift up my eyes and let the sun shine down upon me? Shine down upon me. Life is so bittersweet, full of hope but full of grief. The ups and downs, the ebbs and flows, and all this as our summer goes away. Our summer goes away. The emptiness I feel inside is only as small as a nickel or dime, but as time goes on I seem to think it's as large as a grand estate somewhere, so far away from here. When will I open up my eyes and see the world so beautiful around me? So beautiful around me. When will I lift up my eyes and let the sun shine down upon me? Shine down upon me.
So hopefully you enjoyed some of those examples between the Aurora and the Apollo, and I hope you got something from that. Maybe you totally disagree with me and you prefer the Apollo over the Lynx. That's definitely possible, but what I've found is for my workflow in my studio and what the things that I am doing on a regular basis, it has just changed so much and for the better, everything that I'm doing on a daily basis. Now, there are things that I do miss and will miss. I'm going to actually sell my Apollo. The plugins are bar none, in my opinion. I mean, I think they are some of the best on the marketplace. And what's cool, honestly, is if I had gotten rid of the Apollo a few years ago, I would have gotten really rid of the Apollo plugins as well. Yes, I could have gotten one of their kind of DSP kind of units for sure, but I would be giving up a lot of the plugins and workflow. And now with, their Spark kind of subscription, I don't really even feel like I'm missing out. Now, I mean, like for me, one of the biggest kind of things keeping me on Apollo for so long was their plugins, or their DSP, their console kind of platform. But, I've got Lynx's version of console now with the Lynx, and very low latency. I mean, similar to the Apollo. It is sure bliss too, because I don't feel like I'm getting that colored kind of sound. Other thing that was really improved on the Lynx, it wasn't just like the outputs to the monitors as well and the ins and outs, but also to your headphones. So like the actual headphones, that was something that I really struggled with on the Apollo for so long. I felt like the outputs for the headphones they sounded like crap, to be honest. Really distorted, really saturated. They just didn't sound good. Super hyper compressed. Whereas the Lynx just sounds so much better. And I know the Gen 2 of the X series, they've made improvements on that with the Apollo, but to be honest, quite frankly, I don't think that they would probably improve on the Lynx Aurora. The Lynx Aurora is a standalone converter. That's literally what they do, is ensure that the highest fidelity audio is being able to be passed. So even with some of the upgrades, I don't think even the Gen 2 Apollo would compare. Happy to be wrong, but I don't think it would compare to the Lynx. Now, I do miss some of the elements of, kind of the ecosystem, but what I've found more and more is I am just not using a lot of the Unison technology anymore that UA offers. That was one of the big reasons too that I stayed with Apollo for so long, is I used a lot of the Unison plugs. But what I found is I'm just using more outboard preamps and intend to invest more in outboard preamps, especially now that I can actually really hear and benefit from those outboard units as well. But even still, I've been using a lot more outboard. I can't remember the last time I actually was using the Unison technology. And so it just seems like a no-brainer. Since really right now, I was up until this last few years, I've only really been using the UA Apollo just as a converter, a standalone converter. I outboard into the converter. I've been monitoring more and more now just directly through, console, which I can do in the Lynx. And it just seems like a no-brainer now to make the move. And the other thing that was cool to me about the Lynx, which is something different than any other audio interface that I had seen on the marketplace, this is what really sold it for me. Far and above like RME, far and above Antelope and Apogee, the Lynx is cool because you can buy the actual starter basis unit, and then you can actually expand it. They make modules where you can, let's say, if you wanted to go up to another 16 IO, you can literally just buy another 8, 2 sets of 8, ins and outs, and just literally pop them in like a card into the unit. No upgrade other than that necessary. And so as I started to weigh that just seemed like a much more modular system. It's kind of, in a way, honestly, what Lynx reminds me of is kind of what a lot of people on the Mac and PC debate actually are, in favor of, is more modularity and more upgradability with a PC as opposed to a Mac. And while I am a Mac user, I've fully, invested in their ecosystem. It's too hard to change now. I really do like that about the Lynx. It's super cool. If I wanted, for instance, I didn't even buy my unit with ADAT or anything. I could certainly add it if I wanted to, but the ADAT chip is like $100 and you can just go buy it, pop it in, and now you can connect to ADAT if I needed to. I have 8 ins and 8 outs, which is all I really use on a daily basis. But if I want to get into more outboard, like a huge outboard rig for hybrid mixing, if I want to do higher channel counts moving into my move to Nashville later this year, hopefully, I can do that. I can go out and spend, a little bit more and buy more ins and outs. And I know a lot of people will say, oh, well, that's silly. Why wouldn't you just buy something with a lot more ins and outs? Again, Antelope is the best value on the marketplace. And on paper, I would agree. It really does seem that way. Tons of IO, really high fidelity converters, all that, even their plugin system at Antelope. The problem that I just kept on running into is I don't want something that is not going to be reliable. I work with so many people on a daily basis, 80 to 100 students coming in every week, working on projects, and I use my audio interface as a daily driver. We're literally running up amp simulations as opposed to outboard amps just so we can practice and we can work on stuff. We use a ton of different softwares. It's all reliant on my audio interface. I need something that's going to show up every day and not leave me hanging, and not having to do tons of troubleshooting just to get it up and running again. I've heard so many horror stories with Antelope specifically, and that's not to say that they are a bad company and that they're not improving their technology. I just wasn't willing to take the risk, and so I couldn't find anything from drivers or whatnot on the Lynx products that was concerning to me. I honestly have not read to date a bad review on the Lynx products. So that gave me some assurancy, that, and hearing how awesome their support team is, it just gave me more and more, peace when I kind of considered that. And to this point, it's been 3 or 4 months, I haven't really had anything to complain about. Yes, there's some things that I knew going in that I was going to miss out on. The ecosystem that UA has, really. That's pretty much it. But everything else has been super game changer. I am super thrilled, super happy. And so this isn't an ad for, Lynx. they're not paying me to say any of this. In fact, they're a small company. They're made in the U.S. down in California, I believe, and they're not a huge, you're not something that you see typically on the mainstream charts, mainly because they're at a higher price point, like any standalone converter, and they're not geared towards hobbyist, or smaller kind of, spaces. They have the biggest kind of name, I would say, probably in the mastering kind of field. So I'm probably one of the, less common users who's using it as a daily driver to record, but I'm happy to be so, because I'm just super thrilled with the overall experience. I haven't had to reach out to support one time because everything has just worked, and there's no issues there. But I know too that, when I do reach out, that I'm sure the experience will be, helpful. So, I knew this was going to be a long-winded video, just from knowing how much research I spent on this topic. So hopefully you got something out of this. If you do enjoy this longer form content, I know most of the people on my channel, some of my best performing videos have been longer format. So, what can I say? So if you aren't subscribed to the channel, most of you are not, please do hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for future episodes. If you're interested in anything, audio, music production, guitar, that's what I do here on my channel. This is what I talk about, guitar shootouts, guitar demos and reviews, production, music production, and just all guitar content in general. That's what I do here. So if that interests you, please do smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next video.